really like the new starting stream BGM quite a lot. I listen to it too now while I'm waiting. It's so nice. Welcome! It's Brandy Rose Smith, live from the Forbidden Library. Welcome to the stream. Today we'll be reading more Misperception. Do you like what I've done to the current read count? Hello, Rippy Dippy. Hello, Luke. It is. It's lovely, isn't it? I'm really happy with that new start screen. It generally makes me happy. Hello. That was a big hi. So I gave you a big hello. I got distracted. What was I saying? Yes, Misperception. Do you like what I did with the currently reading in the corner? Because I keep forgetting to update the chapter count all the time. So now I don't have to. There's a percentage and it'll update as we go. Technology is wonderful. So let's do a recap. We are 72% of the way through this book. So I reckon we're going to go maybe 1 or 2 more streams of this, I reckon. Today's stream might not be as long as usual. I am a little bit tired. So, I'm being nice to myself. And when I get to that point, what I do with every stream like this, where I go, maybe 1 more chapter, I'm going to ignore that. But we'll still do some reading. I'm excited to read with you guys. And let's see if we can, make things better, because it's so meh. But we'll tell you how meh it is in our recap. So, our main character is Felix. Felix has lived in a box, in a little cage, his entire life. He doesn't remember anything else. He lives with 3 tormentors, and after being taken out of his box and taken to a scary place where they knocked him out and he heard screaming and all those good terrible things, he also woke up a little bit and saw they were operating on him. Don't know what's going on. He wakes up back in his little cage at home with the tormentors and thinks they must be preparing him to be eaten, because someone else used to live in this cage. And really, that's the only logical thing he could come up with after all those scary things he went through, that he's going to get eaten soon and he needs to escape. So, he runs to escape. Oh, Streamlabs bot. You're so late. Anyway, he tries to escape. He gets to escape. He manages to get out into the wide world and comes across a city with big skyscrapers and things, comes across a trash bin, and for the first time meets someone of his kind. Woo! That thing's name is Fang. At this point, we theorized that Felix is a trash panda, and though there have been things to the contrary, I choose to believe that he is still a trash panda. Because it's cuter that way in my imagination. So, one of his kind that he meets takes him to go meet their leader, who is a really big, scary one of whatever he is. The biggest and floofiest trash panda, called Nikolai, who seems to be in charge of sort of the trash panda mob of the city, and everyone brings food to him, and they have to meet their quotas with food, or he'll get really nasty with them, and he basically threatens to eat Felix if he doesn't meet the quota that he assigns him. So Felix goes out. He honestly doesn't know how to fill this quota because he's only lived in a cage his entire life. He's never had to get food or anything. He doesn't know what he's doing. Luckily for him, he runs into a fellow trash panda called Riley. And Riley is a good old one. He's a good... He might not even be that old, to be honest. I just keep reading him like he's old. Now, Riley wants to escape. He wants to escape the mob. So, after Felix found that out, he basically said, "Take me with you." And the 2 of them, though they nearly got caught, did manage to escape the city and the mob, and they went on their journey to the Promised Land. A mythical place where there's food and where the sun meets where the sea meets the sand. So it's a beach. It's a beach by the sounds of it. They come to sort of the next closest town, in which they have some very close words. Come on, brain. Encounters with some horrible monsters that want to take them away. They have to climb up some scaffolding to get away from those, only for the mob to catch up with them and then run away from the mob. And then while they're running away from the mob, they have to run back through the monsters, and Riley gets his leg hurt. Felix manages to drag him to safety, and they sort of hide in a dumpster for a little while. Once they get out the dumpster, they start their traveling again, because they've been there for a while. Hopefully the mob hasn't found them, and they run into an old friend of Riley's, who he was convinced is dead, called Clarence. Clarence claims he has been to the Promised Land and will lead them there. However, Clarence isn't quite right. And how he said he escaped from the situation that he and Riley was once in is really, really sus. Riley doesn't want to question it because he's just happy to have his friend back. Whereas Felix can very clearly see something is very wrong here. Clarence has led them through a few places, and they are now in a sort of a dead forest, I think is the best way to explain it. And that is about where we left off. Felix has been unable to convince Riley of the fact that Clarence has changed since probably being captured and brainwashed and shit. And now we continue with Chapter 18, Salvation. The group of travelers emerged from the roots back into the thick of the necrotic tangle, which was the name of the forest. During the day, the guiding star was nowhere to be seen, especially with the heavy layer of fog that engulfed this place. Therefore, Felix couldn't even make sure they were still following it. But Clarence seemed to be walking with determination, nevertheless. Like he already knew the direction they were going, and still following the winding trail of the Blackwater River, Felix stayed close behind Riley. If he let... Mouse, come on. If he let him get too far ahead, he would have lost him in the fog. Before long, the dead trees of the necrotic tangle began to space out, and the fog began to dissipate. Ahead, Felix could see the end of the place, and the sun peeking through the clearing. Beyond that, Felix could also see the towering buildings of another of the Tormentors' cities in the distance. The closer they drew, the clearer they came into view. Felix could see the buildings here were all made up of glass, with big windows framing the length of them. The way the glass reflected the sunlight was almost blinding, but the concrete that laid the foundation of the place was pristinely white. The one thing suspiciously absent from the scene was the ocean or any sand. When they got to the edge of the forest, the Blackwater River cut right in front of them and then disappeared within the city's limits. But a large bridge stood before them that they could cross. Clarence put his hand out to signal the group to stop. He looked around cautiously in both directions and then continued forward, over the bridge and across the hot pavement that scalded the bottom of Felix's bare feet. Felix inched his way closer to Riley. Utopia, Riley read, slowly and deliberately from the alien symbols written on the broad sign that marked the boundary of the Tormentor's city. And beneath that, Riley read, "Welcome to paradise." He couldn't even pretend to control his excitement. "This is definitely the place." "Riley, you dumbass. Sweet, sweet dumbass." Felix was hesitant to share in his friend's elation. Clarence winded them through alleyways and around the towering glass buildings of the city until Felix was completely disorientated. It was quiet in this place, calm and almost serene even. The most bizarre thing about Utopia was there were actually trees here, which was strange for a Tormentor city that, as Riley once described, tore down forests to be built. Yet there was something odd about these trees. They each grew out of their own individual small plot of dirt, surrounded on all sides by pavement. And there was even a small fence around them, like someone was trying to keep the trees from escaping. The trees gotta escape. The trees gotta escape. Imagine that. It was like the trees were kept secluded. Like they were in their own little captivity. Felix thought it felt almost like they were on exhibit, and it made him think about his own captivity in the prison. The alien creatures he knew as the Tormentors seemed to love to capture the life of this planet and isolate it for their own amusement. The thought was sickening. The thought was a sickening one. The travellers continued on deeper into Utopia, and a few times in the distance, Felix thought he could hear the faint sounds of screaming, similar to the chilling cries for help he'd heard during his brief time at the bad place, but also the same ones that haunted his recurring nightmare. At first he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, because his paranoia had consumed him. Nevertheless, the screams never faded. Felix tried pleading with Riley behind Clarence's back to turn around, but Riley wouldn't listen. Gradually, the screaming intensified, almost like they were drawing closer to it. When they rounded the corner of one of the towering glass buildings, the screams were deafening all around them, and this is where they stopped. "Is this the place?" Riley called as he covered his ears and tried to yell over the screams. "Riley, sweetie! There's literally people screaming!" "Ah yes, this is paradise. Don't mind the screams of terror." Felix turned to look through the glass of the building where the screaming was coming from, but when he did so, however, instead of looking through the glass, he was met with his own reflection in the window at first, almost like he was looking into a mirror. The realization struck him all at once. His gaze passed through the window, and on the other side of it, just like in his nightmare, he could see the source of the screaming. Inside the glass building before them, there was a row of cells lined with metal bars. Inside each of the cells were members of his kind. This was the exact scene that Felix had seen in his dreams. It was the same place where his mother had abandoned him, and where he'd first encountered the half-tormentor, half-robot metal arm. By the way, you're also cool. Ha! Since the metal arm was real, Felix knew by now that this place had to be real as well. Sure enough, here it was. At first, he hadn't recognized the glass buildings as the maze of mirrors from his dreams. During the day, the glass was less reflective, and those of his kind that he had seen in his dreams had appeared in the reflection of the mirror when really they were on the other side of it. Either way, there was certainly no denying the truth now. This place was no utopia. Some of those who were locked up were throwing themselves at the cell bars. Some of them were desperately trying to claw their way free. Some had given up trying to escape and were crying out for help from anyone who would listen. Unfortunately, it was all in vain. Felix felt a lump form in his throat. Stopping before them, Clarence turned around slowly, craning his neck to them. "We're here," he said. Riley glanced around. The imprisoned had noticed the three of them that weren't locked up and were begging them to help. There wasn't an ocean or any sand in sight. "This isn't the promised land," Riley said in confusion settling on his face. His mouth twisted into a smirk. Clarence shook his head. "It's better than that." "I don't think it is, Riley." Felix felt his stomach sink as he stared at the prisoners, helplessly locked in their cells. "Clarence, you said you were taking us to the promised land," Riley reminded him, the fear raising in his voice. "I'm going to do what's best for you, Riley," Clarence said. For the first time, Riley seemed to notice the cold deadness behind Clarence's eyes. "What do you mean?" Clarence shook his head again, as if disappointed that Riley didn't understand. "Don't you get it?" he asked. "There is no promised land, Riley. There never was." Riley took a step back from his old friend and tripped and fell to the ground. "It's a myth," Clarence cried. "An old bedtime story to help the little kiddies sleep at night. But don't worry, Riley, because I found something better." Felix began frantically scanning the area for a way out, but they were surrounded by the towering glass buildings of Utopia. He could run, but where would he go? Besides that, how fast could Riley even move with his wounded leg? Felix couldn't hope to survive for very long out here on his own without Riley, and he couldn't very well just leave him. "This is our only option for survival," Clarence shouted. "What is this?" Riley cried out in horror from the ground as Clarence took a step toward us. "They feed us, Riley, and they take care of us," Clarence said. "Their way is the only salvation, the only true paradise." "Who are you talking about?" Riley cried. "The others," Clarence shouted. It really does, doesn't it? Felix could feel sweat forming on his neck, and his hands felt clammy. He felt all of the blood rush from his face. "You, more than anyone, should know that this is the only option," Clarence cried. To be honest, it only sounds like cult rambling because that's what I'm doing. The Clarence cried, it probably should sound a lot more psychotic than what I'm doing, but I like my way. This is my interpretation, sorry Peter. "What are you, their pet?" Riley shouted. His eyes shifted away from Clarence and settled for a moment on Felix. And Felix noticed just how defeated his friend looked. But Riley's gaze didn't linger on Felix for too long, and it quickly shifted just slightly away from him, just behind Felix, before letting out a bone-chilling scream. Felix turned quickly, but before he even knew what was going on, there was a loud, clattering bang on the ground around him, and he felt a noose tighten around his neck. Oh, that'll be one of those, when people catch animals and they have the little loopy thing that they tighten. He fought and kicked and scratched, desperately trying to loosen the noose, but it was all in vain. Felix soon collapsed to the ground as the air faded from his lungs, left gasping for breath as he stared down at the long metal arm that was attached to the body of the terrifying half-tormentor, half-robot hybrid. With his last breath, everything around him grew unbearably white, and Felix slipped out of consciousness. Chapter 19, Reincarnated. Well, that didn't take long for us to get to the bottom of Clarence's susness. So I'm kind of glad we stopped where we did last stream. But we must continue. What's gonna happen? When Felix awoke, he was groggy and completely disorientated. Not unlike how he'd felt when he'd woken up back in his prison cell after the experience at the bad place. Everything around him was dark. Gradually, Felix rose from where he was laying and tried to walk forward, stumbling around a bit in the darkness until his hands felt something hard in front of him. Reaching out to examine what he'd walked into, his hands felt their way around the familiar, cool metal grooves. Several iron bars blocked the area in front of him, and he knew he was imprisoned once again. The memories of prior events came flooding back. Clarence had betrayed them and led them right into a trap. The last thing Felix had seen before passing out was the metal arm, with its glistening robotic arm gripped tightly around his neck, in the same place where his mother had abandoned him in his dreams. He tried to make sense of it all. Why would his mother abandon him in such a dangerous place? The only reason that came to mind was that his mother had brought him to that place intentionally. Maybe it was exactly as he'd suspected Clarence of doing back in the monster's lair. Maybe she'd brought him there as a sacrifice to the metal arm to save herself. Maybe even the place she had left him, the place that Clarence had also led them to, was its lair. It was the only thing that made any sense. She was running from the creature and left her son behind as bait so she could escape. Felix was filled with hatred for a mother he never knew. The last thing he'd heard in his dreams before waking was the sound of her screams in the distance. He assumed it meant that even though she'd left behind her son as a diversion, she'd still met her end. With bitter resentment, Felix was glad she had after what she'd done to him. You're making a lot of assumptions, sweetie. Not that he has anything else to go on, to be fair. Now that he'd made sense of it all, Felix could finally put it behind him, and hopefully never thinking about it again. Although, in his present circumstances, never again didn't seem that far away. He wondered what had become of Clarence and Riley. In Riley's condition, he would have struggled to get away, but Felix hoped he did. On the other hand, Felix hoped the worst had happened to Clarence. Spitefully, Felix hoped Clarence had met the same fate as his mother. After he was captured and passed out, the next thing Felix knew, he was waking up in this unfamiliar place. Unfortunately, he knew what the metal arm was going to do with him next, because Riley had told him all about it. It was taking him to the bad place. Felix began violently shaking the bars of his cell back and forth. The bars rattled loudly, but they didn't budge. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he recognized the familiar bar that ran across the front of his cell that latched the door in place. It was the same locking mechanism as his old cell. Reaching out for the bar, Felix pushed, but his strength wasn't enough to move it. He hadn't been able to move it back at the prison either, so this wasn't a surprise. Gradually, as his senses came back to him, he thought he could hear strange groaning coming from every direction. A blinding white light flooded his cell, and Felix's eyes blinked open. He could see this was not his familiar prison, as he'd already surmised. This was the cargo hold of a transport spaceship set on a course to take him back to the bad place. But not him alone this time. It seemed on all sides he was surrounded by cells identical to his own. There were members of his kind in almost every one of them, some groaning in pain, some sitting motionless as if they'd already accepted their fate. Felix scanned every cell until his eyes settled on one in particular, just across from him, but on a row above his own. The inhabitant of the cell was standing, with his shoulder up against the cell bars, and staring out towards the direction of the blinding white light. He was callously picking at something in his immediate recognizable large canine tooth. Ha ha! They weren't the only ones caught! Oi, Fang! Fang! Felix cried out to him. Fang turned and looked down. When he saw Felix, a grin spread across his face. "Would you look who it is?" he asked slyly, and then began chuckling. Felix's face became flushed with rage. It was Fang who he'd first encountered when he arrived at the colony. He naively trusted him, and Fang led him right to the villainous clutches of Nikolai. This was like sweet retribution for his misdeeds. Felix wouldn't have wished his experience at the bad place upon anybody, even his worst enemy. Still, Fang having been captured by the metal arm seemed fitting. And yet, Felix knew realistically, if he let Fang get his just dues, then Felix was doomed right along with him. They both only had one way of getting out of here. They needed to work together. "Don't you know where they're taking us?" Felix cried. The grin faded from Fang's face. "Of course I know where they're taking us," he answered coldly. "Then we've got to help each other to escape," Fang scoffed. "Why would I help you?" he asked. "Because if you don't, then we're both doomed." "What good would helping you do for me?" he replied. "You're dead weight, Felix. Obviously useless. If by some miracle I am able to get out of here, I can guarantee I wouldn't come back for you." Felix stared at him in disbelief. He sounded just like Riley, only Riley hadn't meant those words when he'd said them. He was sure Fang did. "Do you know what they do to us in the bad place?" Felix asked. His voice was shaky, and his hand found the incisional scar on his midline. There wasn't much more he had in him to give if they were to take more pieces of him. "Of course," Fang replied. "I've heard the tales." "And you'd let them do that to me?" Fang chuckled. "Consider it a favor," he said, "because what Nikolai had planned for you is far worse." As Fang continued laughing, Felix reached out for the latch on his cell door, frantically, and tried pushing it again, much to the delight of Fang, who was enjoying watching Felix's feeble escape attempt, and roaring with laughter. Some of the prisoners around them gradually rose from their cells and stared out at Felix, who was crying out for help, desperately rattling his bars. Their faces were all blank. They didn't seem entirely changed yet, but it was almost as if they resigned themselves to the fact that they soon would be. There was no hope left for them. If there had been, loading word processing, wetting vocal cords. I don't know. Reading recommencing. I should have been a robot VTuber. Should have been a robot wanting to read about humanity. But here we are. I'm an author. It's fine. There was no hope left for them, if there ever had been any there to begin with. Life at the colony was a dreadful reality from what Riley had said. As Felix continued desperately trying to break free from his cell, he wondered if the other prisoners would have almost rather suffered the fate of the bad place. His failed prison break was soon interrupted by the loud grating sound of metal screeching against metal, and he froze and turned towards it. That was a lot of ands there. There was a large whitewashed metal door at the opposite end of the ship's cargo hold, and it was slowly opening with a deafening, ear-piercing shriek. I see, that would be a van door. Or more like a lorry, a big old lorry. A truck, for the Americans, I suppose. At the top of the door was a small square window. Beyond the window was completely dark. A large metal arm slammed up against the window, and Felix stumbled backwards in shock. He scurried to the back of his cell and cowered there as Fang's laughter continued to fill the prison hall at Felix's expense. The door screeched until it was finally open all the way. Fang stopped laughing and peered out. Felix sealed his eyes shut. A heavy footstep landed on the floor of the ship's cargo hold, and Felix could hear the prisoners each individually gasp audibly in terror. Some of them started to cry out desperately for help that would never come. More heavy footsteps followed, slow but methodical, and they were drawing closer. The footsteps stopped right beside Felix's cell, and Felix held his breath. He could hear the sound of the latch being thrust open, and he peeked one eye open curiously. There he could see the tremendous, towering figure of the metal arm looming over the cell right across from his. The metal armor reached into the cell and pulled out its inhabitant. The poor soul screamed as the metal arm held them there and then disappeared back the way it had come, out of sight, beyond the door. Its footsteps faded into the distance, along with the screams of the taken, but Felix was certain that the horrid cross between alien and robot would return. If the metal arm was unloading cargo, perhaps they had reached the bad place already. Fang! Felix cried out pathetically. Please! Fang didn't respond, but Felix noticed that he was no longer finding their dire situation as comical. He looked absolutely terrified. A large, hideously disfigured shadow cast across the prison floor, signaling the metal arm's return. Felix sealed his eyes shut as the beast entered in through the door once again. Its footsteps rhythmically thumped on the ground, growing closer to Felix until they finally stopped once more. A latch across from him was thrust open once more, and he peeked out curiously. The metal arm was directly in front of Fang's cell. No, Fang pleaded. The metal arm reached into the cell and grabbed Fang tightly within its grasp. Felix watched as Fang was pulled from the cell, squirming helplessly and desperately. Please, Fang cried. Please, no! Not like this! The metal arm turned and carried him outside of the prison until Fang's screams gradually faded into the distance, leaving everyone behind in a terrified frenzy. Before long, the metal arm returned once more, Felix staring out through the doorway when it appeared, and he inadvertently found himself staring right into the vile creature's eyes. They were staring right back at him, and a wicked grin spread across its face. Felix tucked himself as far back into the cell as he could go, but there was nowhere to hide. The great beast's footsteps pounded on the floor and stopped right in front of Felix's cell. For the first time, he saw its hideously deformed face up close. It was strikingly like the tormentor's. The beast reached its massive hand out for the latch in front of Felix's cell and thrust it open easily. I don't know why that's tripping me up so much, I'm sorry. Felix was shaking with fear. Once the cell door was open, the creature reached its grotesque hand in. Felix wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to try fight, but he couldn't. It didn't do that either. Fear paralyzed him like another noose around his neck. Sealing his eyes shut, Felix waited to feel the beast's clammy hands around the back of his neck and prepared for the end. For an instant, once more Felix regretted ever having left his old prison. With the expectation of the bad place, nothing the tormentors had done to him was nearly as bad as what he'd experienced beyond the prison walls. Scrunching himself up, Felix waited to meet his impending doom. However, the beast's clammy hands never found his neck. Instead, the metal arm let out a loud, hair-raising scream of its own, and Felix's eyes shot open. The beast staggered back, kicking out its long, gangly legs frantically. Attached to one of its legs, like a blazing red ball of fury, and latching on for dear life with his arms and teeth, was Riley! Yes! The beast swung around, slamming its back into the row of cells behind it, trying desperately to shake him loose, but Riley only sunk his teeth in further. Finally, with a forceful kick, Riley was released from the beast's leg and launched backwards against the wall. The beast turned its attention towards him and swung its tremendous metal arm forcefully down. "Look out!" Felix cried. Riley dodged the arm just in time as it landed with a booming clang on the ground beside him. He turned towards Felix. "What are you waiting for?" he cried. "Get out of here!" He turned towards the cargo's hold's door and disappeared beyond it. The metal arm turned again towards Felix. Wounded, the beast was breathing heavily, flaring its nostrils. It seemed absolutely furious. An unspoken moment passed between them as they both stared at each other and then at the open cell door. Before a race towards it ensued, Felix rushed forward and just narrowly made it out as the metal arm slammed it shut to try to trap him inside. The beast raised its robotic arm again and slammed it down, brushing against Felix and only missing him by a hair as he made a break for the exit. When Felix finally emerged into the night, thankfully still on solid ground, he rushed forward, chasing after the flaming red hair that was bouncing along in front of him, illuminated by the stars. Riley was running as fast as he could, even on his wounded leg. Eventually, they came upon the outskirts of the necrotic tangle again and scurried into the safety of it. Behind them, the metal arm was shrieking a wounded cry into the night, but Felix was never once tempted to turn around. Wah! They got out! Felix's second successful escape attempt. But, oh no. That title though. Oh, nobody leaves the colony. Oh lord, here comes Nikolai. He's lost one of his henchmen at least. Whew. Exciting. Thrilling. I guess that's what we get for being the last quarter of the book now. Nearly the last 20%. So this is probably the second to last stream for it. Wow. This is probably gonna be a long one, I reckon. It's gonna take some balls to beat Nikolai. The metal arm is one thing, but Nikolai, he's scary. I am a wee bit sleepy, so the stream may not be as long as usual. But hey ho, I will do my best. We still want to read books on a Sunday. It's important. Felix followed his friends deep into the necrotic tangle until they were finally a safe distance away and could no longer hear the metal arm's cries. They both collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The whole thing felt like a dream. A nightmare, really. But Felix knew it wasn't. Riley spoke first, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. I'm sorry, Felix. He sounded sad and defeated, but almost as if he were about to cry. Sorry for what? Felix asked. I'm sorry for not listening to you. Sorry I got you into this mess. Sorry I can't save you. What do you mean? Felix asked. You came back for me. You're better off without me, Riley said bluntly. Everyone is just better off without me. No, Riley. I'd be dead or worse if it wasn't for you, Felix insisted. You should have left me for dead when you had the chance, Riley said, as Felix's assurances were falling on deaf ears. I couldn't save Leroy, just like I couldn't save you. Felix could tell that Riley was struggling to fight back tears. Riley? Felix began cautiously. Who was Leroy? The last time he'd asked this question, Riley shut down immediately. He may be a Jenkins, we'll find out now. He expected him to do the same this time, but he was wrong. Leroy was my younger brother, Riley answered. He certainly had his own baggage, but he tried to bury it. Felix could see how hurt he was and wanted to help. What happened to him? Felix asked. Riley didn't say anything back, but Felix could sense that he was shaking, almost like he was trying to hold it in and stay strong. But he was about to explode. Suddenly he did. I told him it wasn't safe! He cried. I told him! You told Leroy that what wasn't safe? Not Leroy, Riley cried out. Nikolai! Oh wait, what? Felix didn't quite understand, and neither did I. I'm not the good guy you've convinced yourself I am, Riley said. I've done things, Felix. Horrible things. No matter how far I go, I can never outrun them. What are you talking about? Felix asked. You've helped me so much. Then are you gonna get it through, you thick skull? Riley roared. I can't save you. I'm not asking you to save me, Felix said. But what are you talking about? I work for Nikolai, Riley erupted. How? Wait, what? No? This is going to take some explaining. You got some splaining to do, Riley. The revelation sent Felix's mind reeling into a tailspin. Yeah, I work for Nikolai, Felix repeated. Do you understand now? I'm bad, Felix. Very bad. I'm no better than Fang or Damien or even Nikolai himself for that matter. I don't understand, Felix began, but Riley interrupted him. I selfishly abused our own kind for my own personal gain, Riley said. I hurt them to survive. You're better off without me. Everyone is better off without me. On the surface, Riley had tried to appear heartless when Felix had first met him, but Felix saw through his rough exterior. Riley had come back for him on 3 separate occasions, even after he tried to convince Felix that he would callously leave him for dead, even if it benefited himself. That wasn't who Riley was. No matter how much he tried to pretend, deep down, there was so much more to him. Riley, Felix began almost calmly. What happened to Leroy? Riley exhaled a deep, shaky sigh. Remember when I told you that before Nikolai, the leader of the colony at the time, made the decision that the rest of us would begin making preparations so that we could travel to the Promised Land? But things went awry, Riley asked. Clarence was our leader. Oh no. Clarence? Felix repeated. Yeah, Riley said. He wanted to make a better life for his newborn child, and the child's mother. Oh no! Was Clarence Felix's dad? And he knew he couldn't do it by failing the colony. Knew he couldn't do so in the failing colony. But when he was captured by the metal arm, everything changed. It sent the colony into complete disarray, leaving a tremendous void of power. Nikolai stepped in to fill that role. He killed any that tried to oppose him, snuffing out all the dissenters, which included Clarence's child and the Clarence's mother and the child's mother. Including Clarence's child and the child's mother. Oh. I made a mistake giving Riley this voice. It is hard work. Oh, wow. Drama. That was why he said, we've all lost someone close to us, Felix remembered. Riley nodded gravely. It happened after he was already gone, but apparently he still found out, he said. No wonder he gave up. It was like his wife and kid got murdered. In any event, Nikolai's rule went from bad to worse. He was corrupt, only out for himself. He controlled the entire resource supply. Everything went through him. The colony suffered as a result. You don't actually work for him? Felix tried. He couldn't believe that was true. Riley sighed once more. Nikolai took care of himself first, and those who worked for him next, he said. Although we didn't reap nearly the benefits he did, we were still miles ahead of anyone that didn't work for him in the colony. Nikolai obviously had enemies. A great many of them, in fact. He quickly realized he couldn't kill them all, but he was able to keep most of them at bay by using his chokehold on the resource supply against him. The other members of the colony were so beat down and starving that they didn't dare oppose his reign. To provide for Leroy and me, I had no choice but to work for Nikolai. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, it's fine. Felix could acknowledge it was certainly a grey area. Riley did what he had to survive. I was working alongside Fang and Damien, Riley continued. We spent most of the time gathering quotas from members of the colony, using whatever means necessary. Most of them complied peacefully because they were so fearful of what might happen to them if they didn't. Some tried to fight. They'd only gathered enough food for themselves, and if Nikolai took it, their families would starve. But Nikolai didn't care. When this happened, he would send us to deal with them, to teach them a lesson, and they always learned their lesson. Felix shuddered. He couldn't imagine the horrible things that Nikolai ordered them to do, and he couldn't picture Riley doing any of them. One day, he learned of a plan that some of them had, Riley continued. Nikolai ruled with an iron fist, and standing up to and opposing him wasn't an option. He made examples out of those that opposed him. On that day, some were planning on escaping from the colony just as Clarence had wanted to do before he was captured and changed into the other's little pet. Nikolai sent Leroy and I after them to teach them a lesson. Nobody leaves the colony, Felix said. Riley nodded. Oh, Oh, Riley, why did I give you this voice? Why? He wanted us to go immediately and said it couldn't wait. The only problem was it was daytime. I tried telling him it wasn't safe, but he wouldn't listen. Riley had been speaking calmly, although his voice was shaking. But he'd erupted at the last part. He could barely get the words out to tell the rest of the tale. "It's not safe during the day," he cried out. Felix didn't say a word, but he watched him intently. When he'd regained some of his composure, Riley continued. "Nikolai told us it couldn't wait until nightfall. By then, he said it would be too late. So we set off in broad daylight. We tracked down those who had planned on leaving, and we confronted them. They took off running, and we chased after them. Nobody leaves the colony." Riley began trembling again, and his bottom lip quivered. "We ran after them," he continued, his voice cracking and unsteady. "Leroy was my younger brother, but he was always faster. He was running in front of me, our targets just a few feet ahead of him, and he was gaining on them." His voice cracked so badly that he could barely get his words out. "Last thing I remember," he struggled, closing his eyes and almost forcing himself to relive the nightmare, "was a monster barreling straight towards him." "I see. Leroy was roadkill." He trailed off and went silent. "It's not your fault," Felix tried. "Of course it was my fault!" Riley shouted. "Why couldn't it have been me? I've replayed it thousands of times in my head. There were so many things I could have done differently. If I'd never worked for Nikolai, none of that would have happened. If we'd waited until night, it probably wouldn't have happened. Even if I'd pushed myself to run a little faster, I could have made it to him on time." He began sobbing uncontrollably. It was a horribly tragic end, but Felix couldn't see any way that Riley could blame himself for it. "You can't do that to yourself," Felix tried. "Oh yeah?" Felix cried. "And why can't I do it to myself? I let it happen to him, right in front of my own eyes." "It's not your fault," Felix cried. "What would you know about it anyway?" Riley spat. "You weren't there, and besides, you don't seem to know much of anything." Not wrong. Felix felt the sting of his words. "You are the most pathetic thing I've ever come across," Riley shot. "I've met leaves tougher than you." Not wrong. Not wrong. Felix knew Riley was just saying these hurtful things because he was lashing out to alleviate some of his own deep emotional trauma, but his words still hurt nonetheless. Riley eventually took a shaky, deep breath in. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I didn't mean that." "It's okay," Felix replied. Riley started again, but it was almost like he was talking to himself more than Felix. "If I could have gotten him to him in time," he said, "maybe I could have pushed him out the way, and the monster would have gotten me instead." He spoke incredibly solemnly. Everyone would have been better off. Silence blanketed them again. A soft, drizzling rain began to fall through the trees of the necrotic tangle and patter on the dead roots around them. "I wouldn't be better off," Felix said. Riley glanced over at him. and Felix could see the deep sadness behind his eyes. "You should probably leave me here to die," Riley said pathetically. I'm not going to leave you. "Look at me, Felix," Riley said and pointed down to his wounded leg. "It's a miracle I was able to make it this far. But this is it. The end of the road for me. I'm getting everything I deserve. I can't go any further on than this. Can't go any further on this thing." Felix stared down at his friend's wounded leg. "Then I'll carry you," Felix said. Riley scoffed. Sorry. "You're gonna carry me?" he asked skeptically. "That's right." Riley shook his head. "It is Lord of the Rings. I can't carry the ring, but I'll carry you." "Aw. Nope," he said. "You're gonna leave me here, and I'm going to die." Felix stared at him for a moment. Although Riley said that Felix was the most pathetic thing he'd ever seen, Riley looked even more pathetic than that right now. "Are you done feeling sorry for yourself, bro? Is your depression over?" "Are you done with your mourning? Turn off your emotions, bitch." Anyway, Felix asked rather curtly. Riley was taken aback by the assertiveness of Felix's words. "I had no idea you were such a little kid," Riley continued. Oh, that was Felix. "I had no idea you were such a little kid," Felix continued. Riley turned away from him, crossed his arms. "If you're trying to motivate me by insulting me," he began, "it's not gonna work." "Why would I try to motivate a little kid like you?" Felix asked. "You'll probably just slow me down anyway. Besides, if you stay here, that just means there's more food for me when I make it to the promised land." Riley turned back towards him and shook his head, but Felix could detect the faintest smile across his face. "Oh, please," Riley said. "You're gonna die out there without me. We both know it." "Is that so?" Felix asked. Forcing himself up from the ground, Riley hobbled on his bad leg. "See?" he said. "I don't need you to carry me. I can manage on my own. It's you that needs me." Reverse psychology. "I need you like I need a hole in my head," Felix replied. "You already got a hole in your head," Riley mocked. "It's right in the place where your brain should be." Top bants. "At least I've got 2 working legs," Felix shouted. Riley glanced down silently at his wounded leg, and Felix feared he may have taken it a bit too far. But when Riley looked back up at him, he erupted with laughter. You won't last longer than 2 seconds out there," Riley shot back. "I'm surprised you're not already crying again." "Well, you've already done enough crying for both of us today," Felix fired. Riley burst out laughing again, and Felix joined in. To this point, Felix had already been through so much, but none of it mattered anymore. His mother abandoning him and leaving him for the dead. His torment at the hands of the tormentors. Nearly being eaten alive at every turn. None of it. That was done. What was done was done. He knew as long as he had Riley, things were going to be okay. But with his wounded leg, Riley needed him just as much. The only way they were going to survive was with each other. When the laughter finally subsided, Felix spoke again. "So," he began, "are you coming with me or what?" "Well, I'm not just gonna let you die out there," Riley said. "You need me. I guess you could tag along. But let's get one thing straight," Felix continued with a sly smile. "I am not your babysitter, And you are not my problem. Oh, the sass. So much sass. Riley smiled slyly back at him. Is this how it's gonna go? He asked, remembering back to when he delivered the same warning to Felix shortly before they left the colony together. You just gonna steal my lines? I mean it, Felix warned. If it comes between leaving you to die or coming back for you, I'm gonna let you die. Riley laughed. That's not what I actually sounded like, he said. Yes, you did, Felix assured him. That was spot on. All right, Riley said. I get it. He put his hand out and Felix rested his on top of it. We're in this together, Felix said. Until the very end. Riley nodded and smiled at him. With that, the pact was sealed. And I need a small break. I'm gonna do like a proper break, not just like a I'm gonna sit here and drink. I need like an actual breather, so BRB. And I'm back. Bit more recharged. Let's get to the end of this chapter. Yeah. The unforgiving necrotic tangle. The guiding star couldn't be seen through the heavy fog cover which suffocated the dead forest. Still, the pair walked through the night. I am back. Me back. Hoping to find their way out of this place once again, where they would be able to pick up on the trail of the guiding star. They walked until they had grown so tired that Felix wasn't sure he could walk any further. He wasn't sure what was pushing his companion more now, his desire to see the promised land or his spite for Clarence, who he used to call his friend. Either way, despite his wounded leg, Riley mustered on. With the first break of dawn, they could finally see the end of the decaying tree line of the necrotic tangle. That is such a fun word to say. The necrotic tangle. Through the strangling thick roots, they could once again see the towering buildings of another Tormentor city rise up in the distance. Concerningly, this skyline looked strikingly similar to Utopia, and as they drew closer they could see that the buildings here were all made of glass, just like Utopia. Felix began to grow nervous. Riley, he began hesitantly, this looks just like the place that Clarence took us to. Are you sure we're not walking in circles? Riley sighed and searched for the guiding star, but there wasn't a star in the sky. I'm not sure, he admitted. Felix could tell that his friend had almost reached his breaking point, so he tried to offer some words of encouragement. They all do kinda look the same, he said. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. Riley nodded. Maybe, he said, but Felix could tell hopelessness was setting in. Either way, it's not safe for us to travel much longer. We should double back a little bit to avoid this place and rest for the day. We can get moving again on a different route at dusk. Felix agreed. Together the pair walked back a little further into the necrotic tangle, as far from the Tormentor civilizations as their weary legs could carry them. They found shelter underneath an enormous fallen tree, the roots which provided an excellent barrier to the outside world. There they settled in on the damp ground. Riley turned over and was almost asleep when Felix spoke. Riley, he called. Riley grunted. I just want to say thanks. For what? Riley asked. Felix thought about it. For everything, he said. Don't thank me yet. Silence fell between them once again, but it was a comfortable silence, like one that might fall between two old friends who had known each other for years. Riley, Felix called once more. What, Felix? Riley asked. He sounded slightly frustrated that the comfortable silence had been broken. I don't think you're bad. Felix is such like a blunt ass sweetie. Oh, some things fell over behind me. It's fine. Nothing bad. Riley didn't know what to say to that. Still, he felt warmth well in him, which he hadn't felt in a long time. No. Go to sleep, Felix, Riley finally said. Felix didn't need to be told twice. After the exhaustion from walking all day, it didn't take him long to fall asleep right beside his friend. As much as he wanted to leave the past behind him, he returned to the recurring dream once more. His mother was running frantically through the maze of towering glass buildings of Utopia that were like mirrors. In the night time, she was carrying little Felix with her and looking back neurotically over her shoulder every now and again. There was nothing there but shadows, and yet she never slowed. She turned back once more, and when she did, she tripped and went tumbling to the ground, dropping little Felix in the process. Little Felix began to cry as his mother scrambled to her feet and retrieved him. "Hush, little one," she said, "or they'll be here soon." There was a noise behind them, and Felix's mother turned quickly, eyes widening in terror. Behind her, Felix could see something lurking in the shadows, but he couldn't quite make it out. His mother took off running again until she came to the place where Clarence had led them previously, the place with rows of cells that housed the screaming prisoners, the Metal Arm's lair. Right now, the captives were quiet. Little Felix began whimpering as his mother placed him down in a small crevice at the base of one of the buildings. "Hush, little one," she replied. "They'll be here soon and they mustn't find you." When he finally complied, little Felix was staring back up at her. Her vivid blue eyes, the same as his own, seemed sad. Although little Felix couldn't quite tell if it was regret for what she was doing or something else entirely. Regardless, she glanced down both ends of the maze that she found herself in, and then took off running, abandoning her child there. A grave silence fell heavily over the place. Gradually, little Felix began whimpering again. Finally, quietly at first, but building to full-blown hysterics. Little Felix was crying for his mother, but the cries soon ceased abruptly. From the shadows emerged the Metal Arm, which sent the prisoners trapped in their cells into a frenzy. The creature moved towards little Felix and bent down in front of him. It cupped him in its massive hands and lifted him gently from the ground. In the distance, little Felix heard the sounds of his mother's blood-curdling screams. The alien creature turned to face the direction the screams had come from, and then turned back to little Felix. It said something to him in the tormentor language Felix couldn't understand, and then disappeared back into the shadows with little Felix in his arms. The dream shattered to pieces before him, and Felix's eyes shot open. The dream now seemed to be as complete as it could be, at least from Felix's perspective. Only now it created more questions than answers. He still heard his mother's screams in the distance, which certainly had signified her end. However, he'd assumed she'd met her end at the hands of the Metal Arm. Yet this time, when Felix heard the screams, he realized that the Metal Arm was standing right in front of him, and had little Felix in his grasp. How could it have killed his mother at the same time? It couldn't possibly have. Therefore, the only logical explanation was something else did. Felix shook himself loose of the thought. He didn't care what happened to her. The fact still remained that she'd abandoned him and left him for dead. She tried to hide you, sweetie. She tried to hide you. Besides, dreams are often disorganized and illogical. Trying to make sense of them was a worthless effort that would only lead to a descent into madness. The only thing that really mattered was, against all odds, Felix had managed to survive. Even though the dreams still plagued him, he decided he needed to let them go. He rolled over to see his friend who had fallen asleep beside him, to take his mind off it. But when he did, he saw Riley was gone. Oh no. "Riley?" Felix called curiously. There was no response. Standing up, Felix had a look around. He emerged from under the cover of the tree roots and could tell it was still daytime. At night, the necrotic tangle was smoky and grey. During the day, it was glum and only slightly less grey. "Riley!" Felix called once more. Walking around the base of the tree roots, the long dead leaves of the forest gave way under him. When he emerged on the other side of the roots, he saw Riley, but He also now saw why Riley hadn't responded to any of his calls. He was face to face in a standoff with Damien. That's it. And that's it. That's all you're getting. It's not the worst cliffhanger. I thought we were gonna like just have Riley completely missing, but it's not too bad actually. He's in a fight with Damien, the last of Nikolai's henchmen. And also, that chapter was not what I was expecting at all. Oh, I don't know. Riley must have woken up first, gone out, and then like Damien and Nikolai probably got away when the metal arm was there. And definitely did not go back to help Fang. Fang was the only one that got caught. We didn't hear anything about Nikolai and Damien, so they're still about. And they seem to have followed them this far. I hope the colony is like working to overthrow him before he gets back. I want them to like get back to the colony and be like, haha, I dealt with the traitors. And then like the colony's like, yeah, no, we ate all your food while you weren't here. You no longer have a chokehold on the resources. That would be lovely. Not sure that's gonna happen though. However, again, that last chapter was not what I expected. I saw the you never leave the colony thing, and I assumed that was when Nikolai was going to turn up. But no, we got Riley's tragic backstory. And now Riley and Felix are thick as thieves. When it was very sweet. Very sweet. And very sassy. I love it. Friendship via sass. But that's gonna be me for today. Like I said, I'm a bit tired. I'm not 100% at the moment. So we're just having a short stream, just a few chapters. I don't blame you for thinking that's the last chapter, but we're only 84% of the way through, so we have 26% left. So if I'm feeling a bit better next week, it could potentially be the last stream, but probably not honestly. But yeah. Because I'm not feeling 100% as I know I normally do like 2 streams one week and then 3 streams the next. And I've only done 2 streams this week, but again, I'm not feeling 100% at the moment, so I'm still only doing 2 streams next week. So that I can get some rest on Monday. I'm going to be nice and kind to myself. Do that whole self-care routine that people talk about, you know. Good stuff. I'll be nice to myself. That is the key. But yes, thank you, Luke, for being in the chat. Thank you, Rippy Dippy, for being in the chat. Thank you to anyone who lurked. Thank you to anyone who watches the VOD. If you have not already, please, if you could be so kind as to press those like buttons and those subscribe buttons. They make me very happy, and they make me, like, super amazing, successful VTuber. Hashtag great. I don't know. I don't know. I'm tired now. I will see you on Tuesday, where I will be playing some more Final Fantasy. I will be going to get my nice, shiny, spiky Dragoon armor, and I will look cool from then on in. And it'll be great. Anything else to tell you? No, nothing else to tell you, really. Other than thank you for coming. See you on Tuesday. This has been Brandy Rose Smith, live from the Forbidden Library.